In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of angles. You've most likely had some experience with angles in the past. We're just going to kind of refresh your memory so we have things down pat before we get into the trigonometry. So starting off, what is an angle? If you were to take a geometry class, they'd probably be very particular about saying you have a single point and you have two rays going off of that point that determine your angle. Now, we can have them be rays like this, we can have them be lines, we can have them be line segments. I'm not going to worry too much about them, but one of them you're going to call the initial side, and the other one will be called the terminal side. And once you've decided which one's the initial, which one's the terminal, then you would go ahead and say, how much do I move from one to the other? And the measure of this is called the angle, or just the angle itself. Now, you can place your initial side wherever. You can determine your terminal side based on where you put your initial side, and so on. The default for what we're going to be using in this class is the initial side is always going to be directly to the right. If you know about the XY axes, this is going in the X direction here, and if that's your initial side, then we go ahead and go out to whatever angle is we're talking about. We have our terminal side, and that's how we're going to be drawing angles. Now, when you want to measure an angle, if we have our initial side here, we need some sort of units to use when measuring how far we go around. The most common one you'll see at this type of level of a class is going to be degrees, and it's the one you're most likely familiar with. There is a second one called radians that we will also be using in this class, and that one becomes much more common in calculus classes, because in calculus classes there are certain formulas that work out nicer when you use radians, but they are more complicated if you use degrees. So the general way is people learn degrees, growing up, and that's what they see very often. But then when you start getting into the more complicated calculational things, you want to use radians to make things work out easier. For now, we're going to stick with degrees. We'll talk about radians in a later video. And the idea of a degree is that if your initial side is here, and you go all the way around and you get back to your starting point, that is going to be 360 degrees. And if that is 360 degrees, then if we say, okay, let's break up here, and let's say we have 1/4 of that distance, right? I didn't go all the way around, I only went 1/4 of the way around, then the angle in here, the angle right here, is going to be 1/4 of 90 degrees, 1/4 of 360, which is 90. 1/4 of 360, which is 90. And so you just say, how far did I go? Did I go 1/10 of the way around the circle? Well, 1/10 of 360 is 36. And if you just relate it to how far you went around compared to going around the whole circle, that's how we measure our angles. Now, we generally can use a device, a protractor, to measure them in the real world. But for this class, we're almost always going to be just saying, here is the actual angle. We're not measuring it ourselves. Just use this angle and solve the problem. One thing that's important to know is that you can have a positive angle or a negative angle. And again, we always are going to start our initial side as being directly to the right. And if we have a terminal side like this, and we measure the angle going in a counterclockwise fashion, that is going to be considered a positive angle. However, if we have the same initial side, and let's even say we have the same terminal side, but we decide to measure going the opposite direction, going clockwise, as you can see, I had to go further around the circle this time, so it's going to be a different angle number. And we have decided that going clockwise counts as a negative angle. So you just have to be careful as to which way you're traveling around, whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise, so that you know whether your angle is a positive or a negative number. The last thing to mention here is a few specific terminology that we're going to use about angles. The first is something called a right angle, which again, a lot of people already would know about that at this point in time. And a right angle is just a 90-degree angle. So, we usually use a little square there instead of the curved line for the angle part of it. That just indicates that it is specifically a right angle, 90 degrees. We use a little rectangle there because if you draw a rectangle, the four angles in a rectangle are all right angles here. They're all 90 degrees, assuming I drew my rectangle better than I actually did. The next one is an acute angle. An acute angle is anything that is going to be smaller than 90 degrees. So, smaller than 90 degrees. That is called an acute angle. Anything that is more than 90 degrees, we're going to call that an obtuse angle. If the angle is perfectly straight, so your initial side goes right, your terminal side goes left, that makes it 180 degrees. It's halfway around the whole circle, and we call that a straight angle. And I think you can see from the picture why we call it a straight angle. These last two are a little different. These are called complementary angles and supplementary angles. The idea of a complementary angle is you have one angle here, and then you have a second angle, and the idea is that if you combine both of them together, you get a right angle. So two angles that add up to 90 degrees. Those are called complementary, and I will just point out this is spelled different than giving someone a compliment. It's an E in the middle instead of an I. So again, complementary with an E is two angles adding up to 90 degrees. Complementary with an I is a completely different word. Supplementary is similar. You have one angle to start with, and then you have a second angle, but this time the second angle is enough that adds up to a whole straight angle here. And so this is going to be two angles that add up to 180 degrees. Okay, so this is our beginning video on angles. We'll continue on to more terminology and more facts in trigonometry.